right, welcome everyone to our webinar. Today we're talking about data privacy and bodily autonomy, brought to you by New Moon Network, and we're excited to have our panelists here with us today. Our conversation is going to be about safety, technology, and personal choice through the lens of sex workers' rights. Next slide, please, Savannah. We have just kind of a run of show. We'll do a little bit of an intro to New Moon Network, who we are, why we're having this conversation today. We'll go over some definitions that'll be really central in helping us to guide the conversation. And then we'll go right into our panel discussion with these amazing panelists we have on with us today. And then we'll give you a brief update on how to stay connected with us and to continue the conversation. So without further ado, let's have Savannah jump in to tell us about New Moon Network.
Thanks, Melody. I'm Savannah Sly, and I'm a co-director with Melody at New Moon Network. New Moon Network is a relatively new national entity that is dedicated to advancing the rights and safety of people in the sex trade. We do this through capacity building for sex worker and survivor-led organizations, getting more high-quality funding into the field for sex workers' rights, and also offering education such as webinars like these to both philanthropists and the general public and allies. So this is the second of a webinar series that we're kicking off that will go and look at some of the major social issues of our days and how they connect to issues relating to the sex trade. So today we're going to be talking about technology broadly.
Great. Thanks, Savannah. So some quick definitions just to help us guide our conversation today. So we'll be talking about the sex trade, which we define as a global economy ranging in formality and legality, encompassing a variety of sexual and erotic commercial transactions. Sex work, the exchange of sexual and erotic services, including escorting, stripping, porn, massage for money or something of value. Differentiating, of course, from sex trafficking, which includes the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel another person to engage in a commercial sex act, or causes a minor to engage in a commercial sex act, and that's important. CSAM, which stands for Child Sexual Abuse Material, is really any content depicting sexually explicit activities involving a minor or a child. Often these materials can cause a lot of disruption and fragmenting of kind of our ideas of sex work, and we'll talk about that a bit. Third party, which are managers, booking agents, security cleaners, or others involved in a transaction of sexual or erotic labor outside the provision of the service itself. And then finally, we have FOSTA SESTA, which stands for Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, or Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act, which is a body of federal legislation that passed in 2017, aimed at preventing sex trafficking on the internet by increasing the legal liability for online platforms hosting user-generated content. And those will be important in talking through with our panelists what it means to have data privacy and also be able to enact bodily autonomy for oneself as well. So with that, Savannah, if you could go to the next slide. We would love to introduce our great panelists here today. So maybe starting with Jen, if we could just have your name, your pronouns, what organization you're with today, and answer this one intro question that we have for all of you, which is, who are you and why is it important to be having this discussion today?
Hi, all. I'm Jen Lee. I'm the Technology Policy Program Director at the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU of Washington. I use she and they pronouns. And I think it's really important to be having this conversation because threats to privacy impact, everyone's autonomy, everyone's bodily autonomy, but specifically for historically over-surveilled and marginalized groups, including sex workers, So I think it's especially in light of Roe, people have been thinking a lot more about the connection between data privacy and bodily autonomy, and how the criminalization of abortion can really impact one's ability to live free and fulfilling life. But it's that conversation has also opened up avenues to have lots of other conversations, and think more expansively about the harms of the threats to data privacy. So I'm excited to be talking about the work we're doing in Washington State, and really excited to learn from my fellow panelists and from Savannah and Melody.
Thanks so much, Jen. Happy to have you here. Coco, would you like to go next?
Okay, greetings, beautiful people. I'm Coco. I use all pronouns with respect and grace. I'm the policy advocate coordinator for SWAP Chicago. I've been doing erotic labor since 2014, from community like play parties and being a dominatrix to actually cultivating my own practice, which is being a fetish esthetician, where I fuse beauty services with BDSM kink. So I'm very invested in this, because I'm actually dealing with this on a personal level. So it's like something that is actually affecting me in this current moment. I think it's very important for us to, think about intersectionality when it comes to data in bodily autonomy. And so since my social location is sex worker, Black queer person, I deal with a lot of surveillance and a lot of violence because of that. So I'm very invested into the practicality of these things and how we really transform and really see our personal responsibility in the sexual revolution.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Coco. Happy to have you here. And Tara.
It is lovely to be here with you all today. I hope you can hear me just fine. My name is Tara Wheeler. I am CEO of Red Queen Dynamics, Senior Fellow for Global Cyber Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. And I'm here, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm here because there's a massive crossover between the experiences of sex workers and hackers. I'm a hacker. I'm somebody who's, depending on who I'm talking to, I'm an offensive security information researcher. But I'm the kind of person that often gets phone calls from people who have had distressing experiences involving data privacy online. I work in all areas of policy involving how people are treated on the internet. And I think there's so many incredible parallels between the experiences of sex workers and hackers in terms of their legal position and how we are often subject to laws that are in the eye of the interpreter. As SESTA FOSTA is to the sex work community, so the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is to information security researchers. And there's a lot of ways in which we need to both combine education for policymakers and law enforcement officials, and some rights advocacy among our own populations. There's a massive crossover. We're natural allies in a world where policy tends to target us instead of help us. So I'm glad to be here today to provide any technical capacity I can. And yeah, I've been targeted online too. It sucks. It's not good. I've experienced some of the worst the internet has to offer, and it's given me a passion for really working with people who have experienced this online as well. So here to help, want to live.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Tara. And a brief note about us. So my name's Melody. I use her pronouns, co-director of New Moon Network. I also come from community and have experienced this online data privacy breaches and taking down of accounts, which we'll get into. So I'm with you, and I know that Savannah has experienced some of that as well. So thank you all so much for being here today to chat with us. And Savannah, if you want to go ahead and take the slides down, we can get right into our main discussion.
Great. So thank you all so much for joining us. You're all incredible people, and I love seeing you all on my screen at the same time. And this conversation could go in a lot of directions, because when we're talking about technology, specifically data privacy and our bodily autonomy, there's a lot of different kinds of technologies we could cover. Because New Moon really works specifically within the arena of the sex trade, we want to talk about a couple of things that are happening specifically with regards to the sex trade. And I guess you could say sex in general, because not all these things that we put in the definitions, for instance, like we discussed CSAM, which is exploitation material of minors. That doesn't necessarily have to be commercial in nature. Sometimes it is. And also just a trigger warning to our attendees, like we are going to be talking about things like sexual exploitation and CSAM. So if you need to take a moment to step away from your computer or even shut it, that's fine. So basically what we want to talk with you all today is sort of like from your perspective, the what is happening, what are the impacts of what is happening and who is it affecting? And then what are maybe some alternative solutions or some best practices that aren't being taken seriously that could really help address concerns? And so for our first question, we're going to look at our first question through the lens of concern. We had definitions at the top of the hour, and we separated sex work from sex trafficking. Because a lot of us who have been in the sex trade or the adult industry, we know the difference. But we understand that the public and lawmakers don't always know the difference. And so they're making policy from an assumption that all activity in the sex trade is exploitative. That it's all sex trafficking. We also had SESTA and FOSTA in our definitions, which was a censorship bill, essentially, governing the entire sex trade as if it were all sex trafficking. So we want to talk to you all today about, from your vantage point, what are some technologies or technological policies that are either being proposed or that have already been acted on to address these concerns of things like CSAM, or sex trafficking. It'd be interesting to talk about what's being proposed, what's out there, and also who's behind it, like who's pushing these policies, if you know. So, and this is kind of an open discussion format. We have 3 questions, and so you can all take about 3 minutes in your answers. We're not going to keep you to that tight, but that's generally our format today. So what do you all think? What's out there and who's pushing it? For instance, I might kick it off with facial recognition. Some of you might have some knowledge that because people are concerned about sex trafficking, some private companies have done some data scraping of the internet to gather faces, essentially, right? What's that all about? Like Clearview AI, Tara in the chat, absolutely. So what is facial recognition? Whose faces are being scraped from the internet to stop sex trafficking? And who's behind these efforts? Anybody have any thoughts? Don't be shy.
I mean, I definitely can speak about, Clearview AI and SWAP Chicago being key witnesses in a case against Clearview AI, which does facial recognition. This was pre me being on the board of SWAP, but in Illinois, there is the Biometric Information Privacy Act that actually made it possible and hold these private entities like Clearview AI accountable for, exploiting information and particularly handing it over to law enforcement who are buying the biometric data. And so what that meant because Illinois was the first, this was enacted in 2008, BIPA was. And so since Illinois did that, it made it possible for immigration rights groups, along with SWAP. We were talking about things with how Clearview AI and facial recognition impacts people that are dealing with domestic violence. Like all of us were able to come together and hold them accountable, and that made it possible. It was the first of its kind. People haven't seen a policy like that to hold private entities accountable. The issue is that doesn't apply to governmental agencies. So it mostly holds accountable, private entities like Clearview AI. And I'm unfamiliar with, there's a lot of different facial recognition groups out there. And so I'm not as privy to them like that. But we were the key witnesses to show how this surveillance actually impacts more marginalized people. And we see this with AI and facial recognition being used at the borders and impacting immigrants and things like that. So I just want to start by saying that we were able to participate in holding Clearview AI accountable.
That's amazing. Tara, I see your hand is up.
I want to follow on to Coco's excellent point on this. it is really common for the government. When I say the government, remember we're talking about a fragmented collection of administrative bodies, but I want to point out that often there's an end run that the government does by purchasing data collected by private entities in a fashion that leaves their hands clean of Fourth Amendment violations, specifically the right against inappropriate search and seizure. If the government purchases those data sets and it's already happened, it's not illegal in the same kind of way that them directly doing the data collection would be. And in addition to that, it's not just facial recognition being used as a law enforcement tool. It can also be used in a bunch of different fashions, like control for immigration. The border facial recognition techniques that are being used, you can opt out of those. Everybody here can opt out of facial recognition to get off and on a plane, getting in and out of the country. The problem is that we are all able to opt out. Very few people either know that or in the moment are comfortable with doing so. People that are most likely to be targeted by facial recognition are the ones most likely to exist in a power structure that makes them the most harmed by opting out, whether by losing time or drawing attention to themselves. I and my husband try to opt out as much as possible, just to throw a little sand in the gears and find out what the problem will be. We discover on a frequent basis that we are heuristically sorted into wealthy white American tech worker. Go forth. What are we going to do about you, right? And so as a result, we often experience less friction from opting out that somebody who doesn't experience that same kind of privilege would. Facial recognition is, from its base to its top, most harmful to the people with least privilege in a fully monotonic relationship, without any doubt whatsoever. And the collection of it is technically not as illegal by private companies purchased by the government. It is the exact same impact of that surveillance being done by the government. And that end run needs to become something that is legislated against as fast as possible.
I would love to hear Jen expand upon thoughts about facial recognition, but just to back up so that the audience understands, connecting this to the sex trade, it's like we know that facial recognition is being collected and that it impacts people who have the least amount of power in the overall power structure, right? Because of concerns about sex trafficking, private companies like Clearview AI, which Coco mentioned, just lost a lawsuit because of the Biometric Information Privacy Act in Illinois. They scraped a bunch of faces, biometric information from escorting websites and other websites where sex workers advertise their services. And they sold those data sets to law enforcement, which is what Tara was talking about. And they can also sell it to Border Patrol, right? And to other private entities. So all of a sudden, this very vulnerable group of people, sex workers and people in the sex trade, have their faces scanned, and we don't even know that our faces are in these databases. The justification for this has been, we're going to recover sex trafficking victims. And there are cases of law enforcement using like Clearview AI data sets to recover people. That's great. But I'm wondering, what is the cost benefit of that? Why is this mass data scraping justified? Jen, if you have any thoughts about like why data collection is so pervasive and the justification behind it. It's like, do the pros outweigh the cons? What are your thoughts on that balance?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And Tara and Coco both made really great points. I think, in my work, trying to pass bans on facial recognition technology, government bans, but also thinking about private company use, I think the justification that I hear from the tech industry and also from agencies and lawmakers is, more surveillance equals more safety. And we will be able to use more of these surveillance technologies to protect vulnerable people. And that kind of narrative really flattens, the experiences of people who are deeply harmed by these surveillance technologies, like folks in the sex work industry. And I'm thinking about a few years ago, actually, Savannah and I were both in the fight to ban facial recognition technology in King County, Washington, which is the largest county in Washington state, also home of the headquarters of Amazon and Microsoft. And we know that tech companies tried really, really hard to push that narrative that banning face recognition would be harmful to law enforcement attempts to protect children. And I think that kind of narrative really obfuscates, how are sex workers harmed? You know, are these technologies actually helpful in protecting children? What terms are we conflating? And that's why I think the work that you all are doing at New Moon is so important to educate people about the harms of surveillance, and then broadly the sex worker industry. But I just also want to expand on Tara's point about the influence of private surveillance and government surveillance. I think we're seeing an increasingly blurred line between both private and government surveillance, where it's kind of hard to distinguish between either. I think government agencies are clearly collecting a lot of information to go after individuals and harm historically marginalized and over-surveilled communities. But private actors like Clearview AI are just making it so much easier. And often it's really difficult to tell who's who. I'm thinking about surveillance tools. I mean, we're going outside of biometrics with things like Ring cameras, for example, where just private people like civilians, people in the neighborhood are capturing with their cameras on their homes images of people walking past, and that information is stored in Amazon's cloud. It's often shared with law enforcement, though law enforcement doesn't technically own that technology, and they're not technically doing that surveillance. So this expansion of the surveillance network into our everyday domain is really amplifying the powers of institutionally, I think, like very historically powerful and institutions that have harmed and continue to harm most marginalized individuals. And then just to also add on to Tara's point about the collection of biometric identifiers at ports. In the port of Seattle a few years ago, we had a partial moratorium on the use of biometrics at the port, and our concern was exactly what Tara said, that people, having an opt-out model would really not be sufficient to protect people, and like people would not actually understand how their information is going to be used, and people wouldn't be sufficiently equipped to meaningfully opt out. Unfortunately, we weren't able to, stop the use of biometrics at the port. We weren't able to get this opt-in model, but that's right. That's, exactly what Tara said. People just will not opt out, and there are countless stories of people trying to opt out and being told that they can't, even though technically they are able to. So there's a lot of information to cover, but I'll just finish off by saying that, we at the ACLU, we're concerned about surveillance broadly, the collection of data, whether or not it be biometric identifiers like face prints or retina prints or fingerprints. But I think the collection of biometric identifiers is so concerning because they're really immutable. They cannot be changed, unlike your password or something else that is, less immutable. This is something that is so intrinsic to who you are, and especially when your biometric identifier, like your face, is so tied to your means of obtaining a living, like if you're a sex worker, that can profoundly impact your livelihood, your ability to get, feed your family, to live, to have a roof over your head. So we're really, really concerned about the non-consensual collection and use of face, but also other types of biometric identifiers. And then of course, other non-biometric identifiers that can be connected to things that you cannot change about yourself.
Tara.
To follow on to what Jen was saying, not knowing you have rights is fundamentally the equivalent of not having them to begin with. And when you are at a border and you are told you cannot opt out and your choice is to not get on a plane to see family or loved ones or accomplish something that involves your economic future, not knowing or being able to stand up for your rights is the same as not having them to begin with.
Thanks, Tara. Absolutely. And thank you all for taking a quick deep dive into facial recognition and biometrics with us. And just to uplift for the audience, we've heard about opting in and opting out. And this is an important concept because a lot of this, we're talking about bodily autonomy and data collection. And at New Moon, we're big on consent. Consent is a big differentiator between sex work and sex trafficking, right? So we can apply consent to data collection. opting in to data collection is I consent to you collecting this scan of my face or collecting my GPS or collecting my shopping cart information. Opting out means you might not know what data is being collected about you, but when you find out and you decide you don't want these entities having your data, you have to figure out how to get your data pulled. And that can be a long, convoluted process. So we much prefer opting in because it's consent based. We are going to move on to another question in a minute, but I did want to uplift. We're talking about what kinds of technologies are being deployed in the name of stopping sexual exploitation online. You know, we talked about facial recognition, scraping, escorting, and sex work websites to try and stop sex trafficking. And we've talked about what a sticky wicket that is. That's a slippery slope. But then on the CSAM side of things, and again, CSAM is, you know, exploitation media of minors. It's terrible. It's a terrible thing and it's real and it exists. But there's something called the Earn It Act that has been proposed. The Earn It Act is a follow-up to the two bills that we touched upon briefly in our definitions, SESTA and FOSTA. There's lots that's been said about SESTA and FOSTA on the internet. Go check out the wiki page. Essentially, it has not stopped sex trafficking. It has not curbed sex trafficking. It has really damaged the safety of sex workers and other people in the sex trade. But just to talk about Earn It as like a follow-up act to that censorship legislation, one of the key provisions in Earn It is to end encryption. So if you use Signal or Telegram or other kinds of apps or mail servers that are encrypted, that means that it's a more private line of communication, hypothetically. WhatsApp, thank you, Tara. A lot of people use encrypted services for a lot of reasons, but under Earn It, one of the thinking is it's like we can stop the circulation of CSAM, exploitation material of minors, if we stop encryption. And to me, when I heard about this reminded me of the facial recognition thing, scraping escort sites to stop sex trafficking. Do any of the panelists have thoughts about the utility of ending encryption to stop the circulation of CSAM? Tara,
Well,
I see your smirk. Oh, Coco, after you.
Okay.
Sorry.
I was going to say that I think like encryption is like performative because, you know, they say that like Telegram, WhatsApp, and all these spaces are encrypted, but you still can be hacked. You're still vulnerable. I've had, you know, WhatsApp hacked plenty of times for people in London and, you know, locally. So it's like, you know, really, what does that mean? From, you know, this probably would be better for Tara to answer, but like from what I understand, like Signal is the only kind of close to or remotely close to really being encrypted and private. But like it's always a risk, no matter, you know, what you're utilizing, like when you're online, like, you know, there's no social consent, you know, there's not a culture of social consent in general. And so these private entities, and, you know, they use all of this to exploit people. Because regardless of if you're doing it to try to, you know, to help, you know, folks, regardless if it's minors, you know, sex trafficking or whatever, it's like, you know, it's not being used solely for that. And we know that because we're not getting the consent from people. That is not at the heart of the matter. And so I think a lot of like folks in the sex trade aren't even aware that, you know, data is being utilized in that way. Some of us know, some of us don't. It conflates your social media too. So sometimes you can't even have your world separated where it's like, okay, well, like your Instagram and Facebook, all of these things, if you have like one private account or one work account, like all of those things are conflated. Your contacts can find you if you know what I'm saying, but based on your number, like there's so many things that just, you know, consent is not at the heart of the matter. And I think, you know, as a person who is in the trade and advocate for sex workers, I'm like, you know, all of these things are pretty much just to me, it's from a culture of surveillance and like enslavement. And so we have a, you know, a cultural issue, and it trickles down to policy and, you know, like from facial recognition to other, you know, forms of data.
That's a really good point. Just because apps say that they're encrypted doesn't necessarily mean it. I think a lot of us trust the advertising without really understanding the technology. And so there's a lot of lack of consent in a lot of these tools that we're using, largely because we don't know what we're consenting to when we start using them, unless you really go into the long terms of service, right? But I still wonder, it's like, regardless of how useful these tools are, like on premise, like a bill like Earn It Act, if we were to make encryption no longer something that was possible to have accessible and on the marketplace, would that stop child exploitation materials online? Because that's sort of the proposed goal. Tara, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't just have thoughts. I have opinions and rants, and a couple of rage quits, and I would love to share them with you all. The most important thing, however, is not just the op-ed that constantly is scrolling in my head on this topic. It is grade A number one, helping people in this conversation right now feel safe. I have conversations over Signal that could get me fired or jailed. I do not have conversations over Telegram, email, or telephone that could get me jailed or fired. Okay. Signal, to the best of my capacity to tell, is worth trusting with your life. WhatsApp is nearly as safe in terms of the contents of your message. Signal retains only the last time the person logged into the server and no further information about who people are. Signal is the single most trustworthy encrypted communications app. If you want something that's going to solve a lot of problems for you quickly that we don't worry about, use Signal. Second of all, the conversation about how what Earn It is and what encryption is and why we care so much about it is that this is the moment where sex work, information security, and everyone's right to privacy has collided in this one bill, all the way back from the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, from SESTA FOSTA. These things all happen because think of the children. So in 1986, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was passed because a judge had watched and heard from policymakers who had watched a movie called War Games. War Games is a 1983 movie with Matthew Broderick, a full-on beautiful classic of the hacker world, along with Hackers and Sneakers, obviously. And the think of the children terror that erupted out of thinking that interconnected systems could lead to nuclear war is what led to a terrible law that still haunts us and causes problems in information security and is subject to interpretation from local prosecutors based on their feels, in essence. SESTA and FOSTA, we understand. I mean, the people in this conversation are more qualified to talk about the effects of that than I am, but Earn It is where those things collide. Earn It's desire is to have governments and basically companies, have the ability to listen in on and require that companies be able to scan user material for CSAM. The reason they do this is, first, there's a First Amendment issue. In the same way that we say that governments buying data from third parties that have been doing facial surveillance is more legal than them doing it themselves, the government directly surveilling communications over a private service between one citizen and another is clearly a violation of the Fourth Amendment, right? But they can just make companies do it, and all of a sudden opting into that company's service means you're opting into that surveillance. What does it mean to have something be encrypted? I loved Coco bringing up the point, like my WhatsApp has been hacked, all these things have been hacked before. Hacking is a set of skills. It's a set of what we call tactics, techniques, and procedures that lets us look at information. That could look like breaking encryption, could look like hiding behind somebody's shoulder and watching them type in a password. It could look like sitting next to them at work and reading their electronic badge using a scanner. There's a lot of different ways that you can get information from people. When we describe breaking encryption, we're not talking about social engineering someone's passwords so that you can get onto their phone and read their messages. That's not breaking encryption. Breaking encryption is having the ability to listen in on people's conversation without having to be in the room with them to listen in on it. When someone says that their WhatsApp was hacked, what we believe most of the time has happened is somebody has found their password. You've used the same password on one service as another, or there's been a vulnerability that lets you guess how to get into somebody's messages. There's a difference between that and the fundamental underlying math of encryption, which, if broken, lets anybody listen in on anything. So you can be hacked but not have encryption broken. What the Earn It Act is trying to do is force companies to break encryption so anyone can listen in on anything, in essence. The hard part about all of this is that's an abstract and academic difference to somebody who's in threat, right? I very recently spoke to somebody who was experiencing a high threat situation, and I was getting some information from some folks on how to help this person. And one of the recommendations given was to get them a YubiKey, which is a physical security key, a device key. And I said, I don't think that that's going to work. They've got an iPhone. It's not going to be a good solution because you're asking them to use an NFC key right now. And they said, oh, don't worry. Most of the failure modes on an NFC are super easy to handle. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, do you understand that teaching somebody who's experiencing threat about the intricacies of near field communications in a hardware security key and about how that can help them with their encryption, it doesn't matter. On a base level, what matters is if people here feel safe and able to communicate securely and privately. And Earn It takes that away from us. And that means that the companies you're using to communicate with people, Microsoft, if you use Office 365, Google, if you use Gmail, Facebook Messenger, any company that's based in the United States has to turn over those communications on demand if there's any suspicion of CSAM. That's the thing that I think matters the most here. Earn It is dangerous on a fundamental level, and the think of the children thing is what's being used to excuse it, to break privacy for everyone.
Thanks, Tara. That is, Jen, if you have thoughts on this, I would love to hear them. And also, this is a great segue into the next question about like, what is the impacts of these kinds of technologies, on our sense of safety and our actions?
Yeah, I mean, Tara and Coco spoke so well about this, but I'll just say, I agree. I mean, we all have the right to have private conversations in our everyday lives. They are incredibly important for our ability to live free and autonomous lives. And the Earn It Act just fundamentally, using protecting children as a justification allows for just extremely overbroad, suspicionless scanning of everyone's what should be private communications. And, as I mentioned before, we've seen this over and over again where government agencies and companies in an effort to protect children will really, I think it's just really important to recognize that undermining privacy harms everyone, including children that these tech companies and government agencies are trying to protect. Undermining privacy and increasing surveillance is not the answer to increasing safety. And I think that's a difficult, it's a kind of difficult concept for a lot of people to grasp, because they think, okay, we'll do everything in our power to protect vulnerable populations. But using that to scan everyone's messages is harmful. And also, one thing I will note is that the software that is used to scan for CSAM is really inaccurate. There have been documented stories of people, trying to get medical attention for their child being flagged as people sharing images of child pornography, which turned into a nightmare. And there's countless other examples of this kind of technology just causing unnecessary harm. So beyond all of the privacy concerns, the technology also just doesn't work. So I think that's worthwhile to note.
Thank you for saying the technology just doesn't work. It's like these are almost magical solutions to like a huge problem. Like we're talking about sexual exploitation, like sex trafficking or child exploitation materials. And the proposed, like we're just going to like capture everybody's face and we'll end sex trafficking, or we'll scan everybody's messages and we will stop CSAM circulation. Those are really lofty goals. But we're going to talk a little at the end of this webinar, we're going to talk about proposed solutions, alternatives to like mass data collection and the dismantling of privacy. But before we talk about that, it's like, what are some of the impacts that affect bodily autonomy, especially in a post-Roe world, in a world where access to not just reproductive, but gender-affirming healthcare is under threat? And also it's like sex workers have been dealing with this for a long time, like non-consensual data collection, having our biometrics taken. It certainly restricts our ability to exercise our free speech and advertise, to have conversations with potential clients and to negotiate. what we will or won't do, and what we actually do with our physical bodies. For us, the link between data privacy and bodily autonomy is very concrete. If people want to talk about effects on sex workers, go for it. But also, like with Roe and LGBTQ rights right now, just like what are some of the ramifications of this sweeping surveillance and data collection?
I can speak briefly on, very specific to Roe, some of the things that we've seen since last year and prior to last year. But, in March of 2022, a Texas district attorney and a sheriff conspired to indict and arrest a 26-year-old woman and charge her with murder after she self-managed her abortion a few years ago in 2017. Another person was charged with second-degree murder after she searched online for abortion medication. And in 2015, a series of text messages with a friend about getting an abortion helped convict another of feticide and child neglect. So this is it's really concerning that, private conversations that you're having with others about how you're managing your own body, your own bodily autonomy, your own healthcare are being used to convict you of murder and jail you. So I think especially since Roe, people have been making the connection between why protecting your geolocation information, protecting, your messages, your online searches is really important to protecting your ability to manage your own body. And in Washington, we've been working specifically on consumer health privacy laws in this space, but broadly, we've also been working on a comprehensive data privacy bill because these threats go beyond, of course, abortion and gender affirming care. It's all these threats go beyond Roe. I just think it's really relevant now, and people are thinking more about this issue.
Thanks, Jen. Coco or Tara?
Yeah, I want to just highlight how these things impact sex workers' ability to organize and intracommunal support, as well as access health resources that we can negotiate, navigate, and with the types of providers that are informed and who have harm reduction anchored in their practice. It's really sad because a lot of these Clearview AR, these facial recognition and all of these biometric information, it also holds you to one type of experience. People are in sex work for all types of reasons. It could be for a moment, it could be for a career, it could be for circumstance. There's so many reasons. And I think it's great that you have bodily autonomy where you can get your needs met, and regardless of if it's for survival or not, but your body is a resource of accessing care for yourself, and people don't understand that. So that's why decriminalization is so important versus legalization or other methods out there, because we want people to be in charge with their body, be able to negotiate with the clients, having healthier areas to work in, circumstances to work in, and not being hyper policed and doing that, because a lot of the importance about talking about sex workers, because it intersects with a lot of different policies and also just life issues. And so say, for instance, a person wants to transition out of the trade, with all this information, it doesn't allow you, or if you're exposed, or if people dox you or whatever, those things, impede on your ability to make informed decisions for yourself. And so, yeah, I think that they're people try to make sex work this one size fit all model, and it's not. And I think that's the beauty of it. There's many ways to access this industry, and people do it for many different reasons. And so, yeah, I just wanted to highlight that.
That's a great point, Coco. It's with all this non-consensual data collection, be it our advertisement we post or who we're talking to, and our communication as sex workers is largely criminalized. It does make it hard to organize. Or also our facial biometrics. You can't leave the industry behind. There's always something out there in a database that could be pulled up and used against you in the future. And a lot of it, we've seen increasingly sex workers and people who even just have OnlyFans accounts, being stopped at international borders because data is being sucked out of their phones, or their faces are being scanned, or they're triangulating data different ways. And so that restricts people's mobility. So thanks for highlighting all of those like direct connections between data privacy and the bodily autonomy specifically of people in the sex trade. Tara, did you have anything to add?
I wanted to make space in the conversation for people who face more ongoing legal threat every day than I do. I want to note also that there's a lot of places where organizing isn't necessarily specifically illegal, but it can be used to harm people very specifically economically. I'm thinking of union organizing, actually, very much so, especially the use of company communications that are supposed to be private, or the ability to connect with each other to engage in union organization. This is also a way that people trade information about something that may not be illegal, but may cause harm to others in the information security industry. When we have conversations about some form of technical vulnerability that may harm a lot of people, may be involved in critical infrastructure, we often need to guarantee privacy to that communication, because it's most of the time my experience that vulnerabilities are discovered by somebody who doesn't have the right to discover that vulnerability under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And they are trying to shield themselves from unnecessary, zealous, and politicized prosecution. A good example is the journalist who reported a very visible leak in the Missouri education system's website, reporting all teachers' social security numbers publicly on their website. The governor of Missouri threatened to and attempted to charge that journalist with computer hacking for reporting that vulnerability. The process of figuring out that vulnerability was literally looking at the website's code upfront, unencrypted. There was nothing magical about any part of it. The point being that when people are afraid, they usually have a really good reason for being afraid. And it's usually because there's a big and dangerous power structure that's trying to stop them from talking. And encryption and data privacy gives us the right to organize and communicate freely to protect our rights. And it is more important to have that in place in the same kind of way that we must presume people to be innocent before proven guilty. We have to presume that people have the right to speak privately and organize themselves as they see fit, and that their fears are sensible and that their concerns are valid. And starting from a place where we enable people to speak freely and independently and privately is the place we begin with starting to fix some of this power imbalance in our society.
Thanks, Tara. You really connected some dots. We're centering the sex trade and sex workers and survivors today, but so many people are affected by technologies that are aimed at ending sex trafficking or stopping CSAM, like ending encryption and using facial recognition. This affects, labor organizing. You need private conversations to do that. Journalists need to have private conversations. Sex workers, of course, but immigrants and migrants, people crossing borders, facial recognition, big concern. And they were also plaintiffs in the lawsuit against Clearview AI that Coco was talking about at the top of the hour. So also, people trying to seek gender affirming healthcare if they are trans, people seeking an abortion, we need our privacy. That's sort of our underlying message today. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are alternatives. We talked about BIPA, the Biometric Information Privacy Act that is in Illinois. That's a great example of some strong data privacy law. That's an alternative to keeping people safe. I would love to hear our final question to the panelists. If we're concerned about exploitation, if we're concerned about abuse online, what are some alternatives to sweeping data collection, and surveillance that could actually help keep people safe? And this could be a policy, it could be something concrete, it could be something cultural.
I would say decriminalizing sex work, but done. We really need that. The one thing that I want to state too is about like parasocial dynamics and how this is connected to the violence that is inflicted on people in the sex trade, because often people feel there's this lack of social consent where people feel like they have a right to you and a right to access your information. And so when you're in a criminalized economy, it's just like, well, people are like, well, they think it condones their actions. And so you are, hyper surveillance, hyper like attacked and things like that. And and then like, whatever rules and regulations that are on certain platforms too, they just reaffirm that. And so it makes it hard for folks in the trade to diversify income. So, if you want to do online, or if you want to do street work, or if you want to do the various types of work within the trade, and that is harder to do as well. And I want to say, like, obviously with BIPA, that's like an example of what other policy that could be implemented. And I think the win, because with Clearview AI case, like the win was obviously Illinois was the example, but Clearview AI can't share data nationally as well. This is for the next 5 years. Now they can, share their technology. That's different, but they cannot share the databases or people's personal information. They had to invest $50,000 into like this opt-out campaign and like getting the word out to people that they have the option to opt out. But that is a slippery slope, because you still have to like, share your ID and like fill out information. So even that is just like still a liability. It really is opting out really that safe. As well as thinking about like, what does that mean culturally? Like we talk about sexual exploitation. I think that we, these policies and things impact our ability to be sexually educated. It stagnates the ability for like, as a culture, for us to really cultivate erotic intelligence. And what does that mean? How we see consent, how we deal with trauma, all of these things impact like, what we consent to socially with each other. Like it's one thing to like have a policy, and it's another thing for you to be informed and then not to abuse that, regardless if there's a policy that exists or not. I really think that human beings have the capacity to govern ourselves, but we have to be educated and open to understanding new truths and understanding due to social location too, how does people bodily autonomy really impacted by these things, not just based on our privilege. So dialogical education is important. Panels like this is important because the triad of the panelists make up, a wholesome viewpoint, and we can really like, share and articulate and talk to like blind spots that we have based on, either not being informed or just like really not knowing. But yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Thanks, Coco. You covered a lot of ground in that. Just a couple of things I heard were like concrete things like, yeah, BIPA enabled stakeholders who were having their privacy violated to sue the company taking their biometrics, right? We need strong protections like that. But then there's some cultural things, like learning that we don't just have access to each other, and we don't just have access to marginalized or criminalized people, right? And that we need to develop that erotic intelligence and like sex education, just basic cultural shift around how we access and use information so that we can have bodily sovereignty, right? I'm excited to talk to you more about all those things, but I would love to hear from Jen or Tara about what do you think are some solutions to mitigating harm that don't involve dragnet surveillance?
I mean, from my perspective, because I work in the policy space, I think passing more laws like BIPA is really, really important. And BIPA has really been, so this past session in Washington State, we passed My Health, My Data, which is a consumer health privacy law, similar to BIPA. It's not the same, but it's similar in that it has a really strong private right of action, which enables individuals to sue when companies violate their privacy rights, and has an opt-in consent model. And this law covers non-HIPAA protected data. So apps on your phone, if they collect health information, if companies try to derive health information from seemingly innocuous pieces of information like your shopping history, and they connect it to something related to your health, all of that information is critically covered because all of that is left uncovered by the federal law, HIPAA. But, BIPA and My Health, My Data are really the only two privacy laws in the US that have such a strong private right of action and operate with this opt-in consent model that is the default in other jurisdictions like the EU with the GDPR. So really broadening that to other states, hopefully getting that to a federal level, creating federal level protections that don't also preempt states from passing stronger laws. I think that's a focus that I've been working on. And I can say that supporting these kinds of laws by sending letters to your lawmakers, writing letters to the editor, drafting op-eds, signing petitions, like these are the things that will, in the long run, really help with that policy change. I think this is just also to note one part of what people can do Policy change takes a long time, and there are a lot of other things people can do in the meantime. As Coco detailed, and I'm sure we'll hear from Tara, but just speaking from the policy perspective, I think we definitely need laws. We can't expect companies to be held accountable otherwise.
Thanks, Jen. That's incredible work you've done in Washington. Tara, after you.
Jen was right. You're going to hear from me on this one. I wanted to note that one of the reasons that I do the work that I do at a place called Council on Foreign Relations is because I appreciate the nonpartisan work at that think tank. It's the place that I go to where I can have meaningful, reasoned conversations with conservative Republicans. And it would not be accurate to call me either a liberal or Democrat. I'm probably somewhere around a left libertarian. I should have a fully licensed handgun that I can use on anybody who tells me what to do with my vagina. And at the same time, what we have in our country right now is a problem with democratic capture. More democracy is better. And when we permit a gerontocracy or a piece of our electorate to capture all the political power, we've got a real problem. The underlying problem to a lot of this is gerrymandering that stops meaningful citizen action from affecting our policymakers. I think we can really trust Gen Z, that we can trust people who are younger to do the right thing. And if we let them have a voice that they are being denied in our current political structure, we're going to see things like decriminalization of sex work and meaningful decriminalization of non-harmful drugs like marijuana. We're going to see, we're supposed to call it cannabis now. I think my lovely spouse has said this at this point for a lot of different reasons. And so if we trust in partners, including the conservative Republicans I know who agree with me that more democracy is better, we can build coalitions that improve the fact that we have a captured democracy right now with a legal system that is out of step with the demands of this population. I'm frightened over my reproductive rights. There's been, over the course of my life, a lot of things I didn't know I was allowed to do with my own body. And I'm frightened of not being given that information. I am disturbed, as Coco has said, over the idea that knowledge itself is being criminalized. We need to stop criminalizing important knowledge because people can't figure out how to stop antisocial behavior. And we have got to work on more democracy instead of less. I want to see the ACLU thank you so much for the work that you're doing in Washington State, and the ACLU in general for trying to make balance a key part of voting districts now. Gerrymandering is one of the most important issues of our time because solving that and giving people a voice lets democracy handle the idea of decriminalizing sex work, which it needs to be. There's a lot of ways we can solve our society, but more democracy is better. Less is worse, and it does end up boiling down to people. You can trust people to do the right thing if they've been given the resources they need and they feel safe. Let's make that happen next.
Thanks, Tara. You're right. We can't do any of this if we don't have the power to have our vote count, right? Thank you all so much. This has been a deep conversation. We do have one question in the chat from Mandy. Mandy's wondering, do we have any tips for folks who want to learn more about how to protect themselves or opt out of facial recognition? Crazy makeup? How do we protect ourselves? Can we protect ourselves from facial recognition? I guess that's the question. Can we protect ourselves from facial recognition? Because I've heard the makeup doesn't work so well.
And Tara, I think I heard you say earlier that people can opt out of facial recognition at the border. How do we go about doing that?
The best way to opt out is to know that you are going to opt out and be pre-prepared, overly prepared to assert your rights in that moment. I find that a laminated card works the best. I carry sometimes medical shears through TSA, and you're allowed to do that, but you'll get people that don't know the law saying you can't carry scissors through TSA. Having a laminated card that reads TSA.gov at the top that laminates a piece of paper that is printed off from their own website where you stand there and go, I am more than happy to have you call your supervisor and verify this on your website. And I will be standing here in this line and blocking the 75 people behind me until you solve this problem of my rights being violated. Now, again, looking like this, I get to do that a lot and they don't want to tangle with me. The same thing can happen at a border. If you have the pre-printed TSA and rights cards from what is it, the Customs and Border from CBP, you can stand there and if someone says you can't opt out of facial recognition, you can say, you're CBP, right? Here's your own regulation. Laminating it is like, it's like the chef's kiss is the final touch. You're like, I have to use this a little bit. Do you really want to argue with me? I have this laminated. It's the over the top lagniappe, the cherry on top, that tells them that you are super prepared to assert your rights. Be prepared in advance and rehearse that conversation with somebody, because of the cortisol and fear and adrenaline you're going to have in that moment when you are coming up against a law enforcement official that you're going to argue with. All right. Be prepared for that to happen. Have a backup plan in the back of your mind. Like, try to leave a little early if you possibly can. Understand your own economic privilege. If you've got no economic privilege and you are going to be in deep trouble if you can't make this flight, you don't have the same rights as somebody who has that capacity. But rehearse it in advance. Don't just get prepared to assert your rights. Practice doing it in advance, because your heart's going to thump and your hands are going to shake and you're going to get a hit of adrenaline when this happens. Be ready. Don't try not to cry if you can help it. Like, seriously, this is the stuff that happens to us when we get scared and confronted with an angry authority figure, right? Like Jim, the 60-year-old retired vet who's a CBP officer right now, doesn't have any time for the little lady trying to challenge his authority. Well, guess what? I get to stand right there and make him listen to me, and I'm going to shake and I might cry and I might get like really scared, but I'm going to stand there and plant my feet and be prepared to do that. And then it gets easier over time. It's that same confrontation, work it out, do whatever your cognitive behavioral theory or therapy or whatever you need to do is. That's how you do it. Be prepared in advance to assert your rights and rehearse doing it.
Thanks. Coco or Jen, any thoughts on protecting yourself from facial recognition?
I mean, I think opting out when you can is helpful, but again, I think opt out is honestly really burdensome. It's kind of it places so much burden on individuals. You can't really opt out if you don't really know where your data is going either. So I think opting out when you can is helpful, but I don't think people should feel guilty for not doing that, because the society is not structured in a way that enables you to meaningfully make choices about your own privacy. I think something that can help is informing people around you, because I think even doing this work, I think it's fair to say that most people around me are the default is just going with what the status quo is, and that is just having your face prints collected, just having your data collected in a way that's accessible, that makes life more accessible. And just letting people know about these privacy risks, getting people to think twice before they do something. I think just sharing that information is something easier that people can do without putting all the burden of, I need to really take every single step to opt out of everything, because ultimately what we need is structural change. Individually, we can take individual steps to protect ourselves in the meantime, but those things are not going to protect us all meaningfully enough without that broader change.
And also just really practically, just being aware of when your face is being collected in media. Are you posting your face on Facebook? Are you posting it on your escort ad? Do you have an OnlyFans? Doing your own personal risk assessment. What are the odds that my face has been collected and that has made its way into law enforcement hands? And that will help prepare you so you can decide what actions you will or won't take. Like, I personally am wigged out about crossing international borders. I just am. I've got an OnlyFans, I've had escort ads. That's just, so like international travel for me is just something I really, really think about before I go ahead and buy a ticket. So I feel that my bodily autonomy and mobility is restricted, even though I have not run into that specific problem concretely yet. Coco, did you have any last thoughts before we wrap it up?
One thing that has helped me in the cybersecurity issues that I've been having is tall poppy. Like, it's spelled capital TALL and then POPPY. It is, geared towards like organizations, but they do have resources just to learn about these things. And so like more sites like that, because as a person who's like very beginner as far as like cybersecurity and things like that, it's been really great. It talks about like opting out, different information like that is one of the resources that I've used. I'm also very more aware of like, in Operation Safe Escape. Tara introduced me to that. and help me with my current situation. But yeah, like having these spaces and online resources where you are, where you can kind of like go at your own pace and acquire knowledge is super important. I'm like very aware of like now where, like you said, where your face is and your information, where you're putting it even regardless, it's just being very mindful of that. But yeah, I don't know. I just feel like it's like so much surveillance and things like that. So it's really just a matter of like, having your own like personal protocol. And that's what I'm working on, is like, what is my like cyber safety protocol for myself based on my current knowledge, and like where are other resources that I can like, cultivate more knowledge. So that's where I'm at. And I'm very beginner with my cyber stuff.
You know a lot. You might feel like a beginner, but you've shared a lot of really rich information today. You all have. Thank you for sharing these resources. Thank you for sharing your work. Thank you, Melody, for bringing up our final slide. There's a lot to this conversation. We would love to have more. We really appreciate you all in the audience for diving into this with us. We couldn't get to all the questions today because we only had an hour, but please feel free to reach out to us at New Moon if you want to continue the conversation. We're totally interested. Our email is contact@newmoonfund.org. And just a big round of virtual Zoom applause to our panelists. Thank you so much, Jen, Tara, Coco, Melody. This is an important conversation to be having, and we just really appreciate you all.
Thank you so much.